This session will run for an hour and 20 minutes, so we'll probably take more or less maybe 45 minutes or so for those initial set of questions, and then I would open the floor for your questions. So let me start with Francisco. So I came across one of your papers, and you mentioned that the Chilean experience in competition law, you called it a bumpy road, right? So it's, if I did my math right, 59 years of bumpy road. But of course, despite its bumpiness, compared to us in the Philippines, we've only had about 2 years of competition law. So certainly, we would welcome your insights and any lessons to be learned from that. So my question for you, and before I ask that, you mentioned earlier that the thing with trying to share your experiences with other countries is that sometimes you end up exporting problems of other countries. So in order to avoid that, we're going to make you handpick a particular lesson which you think would be very useful for us in the Philippines, perhaps based on Chile's experience in either competition law or electricity reform.
Thank you very much. It's not an easy question, of course, and you did your math. And how to avoid exporting problems is a good question, especially when foreign consultants come to your country, as is my case, and start lecturing you. But that's not the idea of this. But one recommendation is to realize that first, countries have different geographies. That's something very, very particular. It's not easy to get the Chilean model, or I don't know, English model, move it to Philippines. As in the panel in the morning we were talking about. Well, and Graciela was showing the prices of that appeared from the PMR study. Well, maybe ask some of the countries that don't seem to be with such or prices so high as in Philippines, maybe having a big set of subsidies. So you may be starting to show the real cost of the energy and considering the missionary services you have in the island. And there are many objectives, not only low prices. Low prices can be obtained with very poor reliability. So you may want to have much higher reliabilities, a more reliable system, more safety, without blackouts or brownouts. But it's going to be more expensive. So there are. It's a long-term view of supply, electricity supply, but also you want to have competition at low prices. So there are mixed objectives. Not easy to fulfill together sometimes. Reliability, but also you want access. You want to sometimes eliminate cross subsidies or eliminate fiscal subsidies, which can be the case. So it's hard to introduce and have pure competitive markets in some countries, and being compared to neighbor countries that may have low prices may be a result of, I don't know, sometimes they are also oil producers and you're not oil producers. I'm not sure. So I'm not sure of this exact situation of Philippines. But it's not an easy solution. It's not an easy to export consultants or import consultants to give you the right results. You have to take care of what their advice actually, and be careful of their advice. That would be you have to be careful of their advice of foreign advisors. That will be my handpicked lessons. Be careful of foreign advisors, such as me. No, but yeah, that will be a first lesson. And don't underestimate, as I was saying previously in the morning, don't underestimate. Even some competition between agencies can be good, because the energy regulator may have a different set of objectives. One of it can be competition, but there are many other objectives overlapped. So And the competition authority has a competition mandate, a clear competition mandate, and they are not subject to regulatory capture. They are used to talk with many industries, so they are less subject to capture than specialized regulated sectors, enforcers. So some competition may be useful, but also competition in in the energy sector demands good understanding of the rules of the particularities of the electricity markets in general. So it's not easy to have a good competition authority in the energy sector working properly. The case of Chile, for instance, has been. We had a good number of cases in the early 90s and early 2000s, but nowadays the competition authority, which is allowed to enter into electricity field, has not entered for a good time, despite having problems. In that case, the recent solution has been to allow and to create a mandate to the system operator of competition and promoting competition there. And so we'll see how it works, but it has just started.
So you mentioned a couple of times, you reminded us that there are many social objectives that that regulators have to think about in general, not only how to achieve those objectives, but also perhaps identifying the proper social objective and the right priority. So clearly, the regulatory environment would be important to think about. So given that our market structure is something like we have a fairly competitive generation and of course natural monopoly for transmission and maybe distribution which is transitioning into something that's more competitive. So given that kind of a market structure at the moment, do you think that there's some kind of an ideal regulatory environment or setup? I know that Rochella mentioned this this morning, that this is very important to think about. I know it's a stretch, it might be a difficult question, but perhaps some thoughts on this.
Well, in some cases, I would say more choice is good. I mean, if you are able to build, we've had this problem in Chile. We haven't been able to create a good retail competition. And it hasn't been a priority. It has just started to be an issue studied properly in the last couple of years. But after 35 years of no competition or no introducing of competition in the distribution sector, it is a big task, and we haven't performed it properly. But I would prefer to have retail competition, and there are some studies, of course, that show that it's a good scenario. However, I would say that, and since the Philippines, I would say, has a particular geography, in some cases, too much choice is not good. So you may have to recognize that in some cases, isolated places, islands, you have to have vertical integration, and you have to fix set rates, recognizing vertical integration, probably just as what a utility would be. Vertical integrate, and that's it. Promoting competition there would be maybe inefficient. You may lose some scale economies, so you may have to recognize that rivalry is not only one of the results of competition, it's also low prices, having a monopoly in some cases.
Mr. Khelawan sort of described the relationship between EPDP and the energy regulator. I'm not sure if I didn't catch it, but how is it like in Chile? Do you have a separate energy regulator? What's the relationship between the energy regulator and the competition authority? Is it similar to how it is in Australia? Fairly, so you have an independent energy regulator, but they work closely with the EPDP, particularly in terms of resource sharing.
No, we don't have an agency as EPDP. We have a consumer enforcer, a consumer court, separate, or consumer tribunal. Sorry, competition tribunal. Excuse me. Energy regulators are not independent. They are politically designated. Both there's an energy enforcer, an energy regulator, and a Ministry of Energy, and they don't relate with the competition authorities. They don't have any work together, I would say. There haven't been many disputes, I would say, between them. There haven't been, but there could be more. And nowadays we also have an expert body that since 2004 that is a dispute resolution body that addresses some open access issues in the regulated market, in the electricity market. Sorry, there's some relation there with the energy regulator, but not that much. But it has worked so far so good. But it could be.
So let's move on to Australia at this point. So I was looking at your slide that had a timeline for reforms. I'm not going to ask you how old you are today. Maybe you were 2 years old. You said that you were an energy regulator for New South Wales. That was the second part of the timeline, right? So you were probably 5 years old then, right? So, okay, my question is, I was very surprised that within 2 decades or so, you actually managed to achieve full deregulation of prices. So I'm wondering if, so what special thing did Australia do? Was it something that you attribute to maybe good design, or maybe was it something more implementational, or was it like a mix of both?
Thank you. Yeah, never put a slide with a timeline and mention your birthday. That would be a lesson I'll take away from this one. Yeah, I guess in terms of what's made Australian energy market work, and I guess your question goes to retail competition and the prices to small consumers not being regulated. I think the start of the reform had the right principles figured out. I mean, what the governments decided to do was allow competition to work where it would work, and for the government and the regulators to get out of that space, and then regulate the bits that needed regulation, both in terms of natural monopolies, which everybody understands, but on the wholesale and retail competition, I mean, there are aspects that you do regulate as a sector. For example, what are the rules of participating in a wholesale market? What is the rule of unethical bidding behavior? That's sector specific. And then there are competition regulators that would look at how the market, what the level of market concentration was, and what the potential for acquiring or abusing market power is, and intervene in those areas as necessary. And on the retail side, obviously the customers needed to be protected. In the early days, the prices remained regulated to give the confidence to the people or to the consumers, and then also manage the political flack that might come out of deregulating prices too soon. But I think what's made Australia work is the 3 pillars of the reform process. To get the structures right, get the rules and the regulatory framework worked out between competition law and sector-specific regulation, and then put the right institutions in place that worked together with each other to make sure that the rules were followed. And finally, I think the commitment to stick to reform. I mean, there have been a lot of cases where things have occurred which would have caused the politicians and the regulators to intervene, but they resisted the temptation to intervene too early. They looked at more objectively what was working and what was not, and then tried to address those problems by a non-regulatory or non-interventionist means. And I think that's what led to where the Australian energy market is today. Having said that, it's not perfect. I mean, there are difficulties. From time to time, as I put out on those news slides, there is a lot of flack in the media. Politicians are forced to intervene. They need to be seen to be doing things, but so far they have resisted intervention that's not well considered or well conceived. And I think that's where the strength of the reform processes.
We'll take all of those things in, we'll be reminded by all of those things, and maybe we should invite you 30 years from now. We'll probably happily share with you good experiences. I noticed also in your slide that in the second phase, so you first unbundle, and then in the third phase, you went back to, I guess, selected vertical integration, I guess, in some areas. Can you tell us a little bit about that? I mean, what were the sort of parameters or considerations for moving into vertical integration at one point?
Yeah, I mean, it's quite funny because I started off my career in a vertically integrated public sector enterprise, worked for a private company, and argued the case for why we need to be vertically integrated, and then went to work for the regulator and said why that wasn't a good thing. I mean, the main reason, I think, for vertical integration, I mean, initially the markets were competing, wholesale, retail, but the players were different. So the issue became for the retailers in particular, and we were one of the retailers, was to hedge yourself or protect yourself from the volatility in the market. And initially that started off with contracts, financial contracts. And then once the contracts started become a bit thin, the idea of vertical integration arose because that gives you a physical edge. So you are actually generating the power yourself. And that's what led to vertical integration. And the ACCC at the time, when we first started the process of integrating vertically, wasn't very keen on the idea. They actually tried to stop AGL, where I was working, buying interest in a generation company. And they claimed that that would substantially lessen competition, will lead to market power and potential abuse of that power. But AGL at the time successfully argued the case that it was a risk management measure and that it would contribute to the competitive process rather than impede it. And I think as a result what's happened is a lot of other retailers have merged with generators, so now you have competing gentailers instead of the original design.
Dr. Fabella wanted to ask a question on maybe, would you have some lessons from your New Zealand experience? I mean, are there things that might be of use for us at this point in time?
I think this again is a tricky one. I mean, the lessons are dependent on what your circumstances are. And I guess how applicable those lessons are in the Philippines context. I do realize that this market here is substantially different to what Australia is like. So I guess you have to be careful what we try and export to you, what Australia tries to export to you. But I think one of the lessons would be to have some clarity around what the objectives of the reform are, have the principles well defined, and then stick with it. I mean, things won't work out, and there's always a temptation to go back and try and intervene in the market because you think you can have a quick fix. But in the longer term, I don't think that will help because I think once you've got your principles right and you are committed to it, then you try and work towards unblocking the process rather than trying to intervene in it, because I think that would be a backward step.
Yeah, I've never been to New Zealand. But I'll talk a little about the New Zealand experience because I think it has object lessons for the Philippines. You know, EPIRA, which we talked about this morning, was indeed radical. In fact, I thought at that time it was too radical for the time. But as radical as it was, it did not touch one important aspect of Philippine power industry. It did not touch electric cooperatives. Electric cooperatives are big in this country. They're small, but in other words, they serve 54% of all our connections, household connections. So they are sizable. So we have private distribution utilities. We have electric cooperatives. There are 120 of them. And then there are a few smattering of municipally run DUs and co-op. But electric cooperatives is really the big elephant in the room. And the conversation during EPIRA, which the advocates were rooting about, was corporatization. And I think the most important corporatization exercise and the most, one might say, the most radical is New Zealand. Can I have some? I have something on that, but it looks like I don't have it. Okay. Before 1992, New Zealand's energy electricity distribution was in the hands of about 60 electricity supply authorities, or ESAs, consisting of municipal electricity departments and trusts. Just to give you some eye view of New Zealand, where I never have been, although I wish I would. New Zealand consists of 2 main islands. This is a slide that we prepared for discussion within our group by Ken Moore. North is 75% of the total population, and South Islands is 25% of the total population. Hydropower is the main source of electricity, 54%. 80% of energy supply is renewable, so it's a bit different than the Philippines. The Philippines is renewable around 35%. There are 5 main generators having vertically integrated retail businesses, and they're called gentailers. In New Zealand, generators are allowed. Risk-taking. Generators are allowed to sell electricity directly to consumers, and they are called gentailers. So there is no firewall separating the two. There's no subsidies or fit to support renewables, which is true in the Philippines but not true in New Zealand. Next. Next, please. Transmission. Transmission in New Zealand is owned by the state. So it's different than the Philippines. That's why EPIRA is radical, because it also privatized transmission. And the Commerce Commission sets the total regulated revenue Transpower can receive. The Commerce Commission regulates the industry. Distribution, there are 29 companies owning and controlling local lines and cables. They can compete in generation and retail markets, but affiliated generation and retail businesses must operate at arm's length to the monopoly distribution business when generation exceeds 50 megawatt. The retail market. The retail market is contestable up to the level of the household. And New Zealand's retail market is so brisk. In fact, they have the highest switching rate in the world. So households switch very easily. They don't have to leave them. They don't have to leave their offices or their rooms. They just do it through the computer. About 75, there are 31 companies, selling electricity to residential and business end users. 75% of the households have smart meters, which facilitate the remote measurement of actual usage. End users are free to switch between retailers, and the market enjoys the world's fastest switching rates. Okay, now how did the current structure evolve from where it was? In the early 80s and 1993, New Zealand's power industry was like most of the power industries in East Asia. They're integrated and owned by the government. Controlled by the electricity supply authorities, owned by local government and local community trust. Then in 1993, something radical happened. Something like our EPDP. The idea was to corporatize ESAs, and control was transferred to 40 electric power companies. So the names changed now. Geographic retail franchises were removed, and competition commenced for consumers with half-hourly metering. In other words, the distribution companies that used to be switched their business model from retailing to wires. They essentially became wires business companies. But they were allowed to do retailing. But most of their businesses essentially became wires. In 1999, retail companies are created by separating them from monopoly distribution businesses. Retail companies merged and vertically integrated with generators. And that is why today there are 5 major gentailers. There are heavy generators, but they are also retailers. And retail competition commenced for consumers without half-hourly metering. Don't ask me about that. That's a technical issue. Currently, there are 5 major retailers. All of them are vertically integrated gentailers and are major generators as well. These 5 companies have market share of 96% of the electricity purchased from the wholesale market, and the remaining 4% is purchased by a number of small retailers. The electricity retailing has been gradually concentrated to big retailers, with top 3 firms capturing more than 70% of the market. So at the moment, we have about 20 RES, retail suppliers, at least registered. But we can see from this model that in time, they will consolidate. And at some point, maybe 5 or 6 of them will be left in the field. This is the last one that I will show you is this. This is the last slide. Now, this is the trajectories of residential in yellow, commercial in blue, and in the this is the midpoint, about the 1990s. And you see what happened. Industrial, commercial went from here to here to here to here. So in terms of commercial rates, it was fairly successful in lowering the rates. Industrial also went down. Well, not very much. But the mystery is this. The residential rates went from, the orange, okay, went from down here to up there. It is puzzling to observers of the New Zealand power industry. They're still asking why that happened. This is a very, very market-oriented power industry. But this separation is very mysterious. Was it because the competition for the commercial became so hot that then they sacrificed the retail market? In other words, if you think of it in terms of subsidies, before, this market was subsidizing this, and after, this market was subsidizing this. We don't know. The observers are still trying to puzzle out what the problem was. The lesson is, it is possible for a completely deregulated retail market to have divergences in prices, like you see here. It was good for commercial, perhaps to some extent for industrial buyers. But if you ask the consumers today whether they would, given this fact, whether they would go the same route, they'll probably say no. Now, I'm talking only of prices here, I'm not talking about quality. But the fact of the matter is, perhaps choice has a value, and that value is important to residential consumers. They're willing to pay to have the choice. We don't know. So I leave you with that mystery. That's a mystery to their economists, and still a mystery to the rest of the world. Thank you.
Stella,
Yes.
if I may be able to demystify the mystery. Just some
Please go
thoughts.
ahead.
Just some thoughts. The regulator and even the DOE has actually seen this. We've been to New Zealand and Australia, and we've actually spoken with the ACCC, the AER, and even with the New Zealand Exchange. And one of the concerns really is how to be able to balance the deregulation with the impact on the consumers. This one, the slide that Professor Fabella actually showed us, actually recognizes that commercial and industrial customers have a very different load factor than the residential customers. And when we transition towards retail competition and open access and giving your 1 megawatt and above consumers with the power of choice, the natural engagement became better prices for those contestable customers, primarily because you had maybe an 85 at the lowest, 85% to maybe 90-95% load factor that could be that was more efficient for the commercial and industrial users. Secondly, they paid better. And the relationship, the establishment of the goodwill towards those customers became a primary consideration. Therefore, even among the contestable customers, there was a kind of contest, so that the retail electricity suppliers were now trying to win them. So if you have a basket of, we have about, right now we have more than 30 retail electricity suppliers. We started off with about maybe 7 and then 11, 14 and whatnot. The contest was for more or less 1,500 plus customers. Just in number, I'm talking of nominal numbers, accounting for more or less only 3,700 megawatts of power. And that one already includes your 750, between your 750 megawatts, 750 kilowatts to 1 megawatt. So what happened is that your natural retail electricity suppliers back then were your distribution utilities. They had all of the data on the load profile, even the financial viability, etc., of these contestable customers. So we would see that the contestable customers themselves, who were supposed to have the power of choice and who should have been given a for lack of a better term, a better deal in terms of electricity rates, were themselves complaining both to the DOE and the ERC that nobody was making any offers. So apparently what was happening was that retail electricity suppliers, including distribution utilities acting as local retail electricity suppliers, were running towards winning the better customers, leaving at the sidelines your condominium corporations probably, or other contestable customers. So that possibly also could happen to us. That's why in the establishment and in the implementation of retail competition on open access, even the implementation itself took much time. If I may, one of the concerns is how have we been able to implement the EPIRA? Earlier this morning, we've already heard our panelists say that as it was written, certainly the policies and the intent of the law is very laudable. But implementation-wise, just like any other law perhaps, and in any other jurisdiction, I would like to think, we are challenged by interesting times, not just locally, but even global and financial landscapes that will affect the energy sector, has also taken its toll on the implementation of the policies in the EPIRA. Privatization, well, before privatization, the unbundling itself. It's no joke to have 140 distribution utilities unbundle the rates and make heads or tails over the NPC, National Power Corporation time of use rates, etc., transmission, when it was now going to become privatized, and then their own distribution, supply, and metering charges. So, in the unbundling itself, how much time did that take? Secondly, the privatization, which required 70% of the privatization, both of the IBPs, the generators themselves, the GenCos themselves, and the contracts. Remember, we had the IPPAs. It took some time, and the actual declaration of the 70% only came at around 2011, if I am not mistaken. The establishment of the wholesale electricity spot market, Luzon came in 2006, the Visayas came in 2010, in December of 2010. Mindanao, we are just on the last leg of our, what we call trial operations, although it's been launched already. And yet, even that is sort of like an independent market, but not really, because we only have one market, because there is no interconnection. So we have a very challenging landscape, and that's why Commissioner Tarok earlier said that the EPIRA itself is a journey. But it's not to say that we're giving up on it. It's just that progressively, perhaps, a revisit and a review on the timelines and how realistic is it really to be able to implement down to the retail level what we want the consumers to enjoy, which is the power of choice. When Professor Fabella was talking about the ability of the electric cooperatives to be able to compete, or to like what happened in New Zealand, wherein there was actually a sort of like a getting together. Instead of you have 80 or so, you only had 40. Even the EPIRA itself, and in the National Electrification Administration Charter, and the amended one, it provides for corporatization and a recognition that they can become a corporate body, whether it's still a cooperative but stock cooperative. However, it still leaves to Congress the franchise. And so far, because of the archipelagic nature of our territory, it has become geographic in nature. But it is not to say, and I'm sure the economists would be able to show economies of scale or the cost benefit of being able to establish maybe a conglomerate that will hold Basilan, Sulu, Tawi-Tawi. and then maybe all the SPUG areas of Luzon or the Visayas, which is pretty much what NPC, the National Power Corporation, has been trying to achieve as the one now with the responsibility, as the agency with the entity, the agency that is tasked to ensure the missionary electrification development program. But to be able to tie in all of this, you have to be very patient. Very, very, very patient, because we have a very, I would like to think, informed we have very informed stakeholders who have very, very, very divergent interests. And I keep saying this in the fora and in whatever forum that I may be in. The regulator's role is always to make certain that they are on the same level of unhappiness. Nobody should be more happy than the other. No, that's just to provide levity. But equity in misery. But we've seen how even our consultants here are cautioning us against being able to import, whichever perspective it is, their experience and applying it to our own. For me personally, yes, we learn, but we have to take into consideration our own landscape. I mean, it's no joke having 7,107 islands, 2,000 of which are inhabited, which we know of, we're not really sure, there could be more. And the fact that, policies in government may change. Even if you say that you have an independent regulator, you have an independent competition commission, policies may change, and the implementation of a regulatory framework is only as good as the policy. It takes much political will to be able to say, we do this, we don't do this. Because at the end of the day, we're answerable to over 100 million Filipinos who, as yet, will have to experience for everyone 24 hours of electricity. Yes, the regulator has already put in place advanced rules on advanced metering infrastructure. Even our rules on prepaid metering and the like, we have pilot projects for that. But as I said, I'd like to borrow our title, Fostering Dynamic Competition in the Philippine Power Industry. The first rule is patience. You cannot force things. We've seen how the lack of transition in our rules have led to a lot of disagreements, or rather failure to understand. Okay? We've seen that even with the regulator when we tried to put in the competitive selection process, but we failed to be able to put in a transition period that would recognize certain concerns. Even in retail competition and open access, apparently our transition period was not enough, and it's been 4 years, 5 years already. We've seen how even the electricity market, when we put that in place, when the DOE put that in place and tried to put that in place way back in 2014, 2015, again, the transition period was crucial and critical, because you have to make sure that the stakeholders you will impose these rules on have a very good understanding, appreciation, and more importantly, capacity to be able to run with the policy and the regulatory framework that you are going to establish. So, good. No, it's not good luck. It's more like we're getting there, and even other countries have been coming to us to learn. Thailand, Indonesia, Vietnam has been here twice, thrice. I have personal knowledge of that because I used to be with the DOE, and even now in the ERC. Myanmar just recently came to us. Even the Middle East, when they were establishing their electricity market. Although, unfortunately, they also poached a lot of our experts in middle management, offered them, a really good compensation package. So yes, we're getting there, but as Commissioner Taruk says, it's a journey. And yes, please be patient with your government.
Maybe just a follow-up question. So you very well described the challenges, so which are both implementational as well as some design issues. But any specific proposals or actions that you intend to take, particularly for improving retailing?
Unfortunately, right now, retail competition and open access has experienced a slight bump. It's called the TRO. So there's actually a temporary restraining order from the Supreme Court, and unfortunately, both the DOE and the regulator were actually left with no policy that would enable us to move forward. Basically, it is a wholesale TRO that has left more questions to be asked than to put in place where we're supposed to be. But be that as it may, the DOE has in fact had public consultations on a new and improved. So just like parang laundry soap, di ba? New and improved policy to take on retail competition and open access. We'll see how that goes without either one of us being held in contempt. Secondly, the electricity market in Mindanao is on its trial operations. Although financial settlement is still outside, and we're moving towards a 5-minute interval, no longer the hourly interval, so that's a big jump actually. We're also poised to establish the reserve market, co-optimized with the wholesale electricity spot market. We should be reviewing already both the price cap and the secondary cap, as was envisioned way back in 2015 when this was actually established. In terms of being able to grow the supply, the Department of Energy has actually the Office of the President has come out with Executive Order number 30 that has identified energy projects as projects of national significance, and this will ultimately be able to address investors and their concerns in terms of being able to establish a power generation company in a more timely manner. The incentives for renewable energy, moving towards the renewable portfolio standards, green energy options, that's well underway. We have a fully subscribed target for both solar and wind in the renewable energy technologies. We still have for hydro and for hydro and biomass. For the islands, where we really need to be able to establish a more efficient and reliable generation capacity, the hybrid technology and generation mix is being pushed by the DOE. Tariff-wise, however, that is where the cost of electricity is also drawing much of a challenge, because these areas are under what you call a subsidized approved generation rate. So if the true cost of generation is anywhere from 15 pesos to about 20, 25 pesos, sometimes 40 pesos, they're only actually paying an average of 5 pesos and 64 centavos. And the difference becomes a universal charge for missionary electrification for the rest of the consumer base. So that's right now, that's the 0.1561 centavos per kilowatt hour that you see in your electricity bill. Being able to entice investors, it is not just about being able to establish a good enough and reliable, or maybe a safe haven for investors just in the energy sector. I'd like to think that it's more holistic than that, because they will also look at how historically we've treated them. So contracts that have been entered into prior to, how do we honor them? How do we enable them? Much of that is what the investors and the fund managers actually look at. In terms of being able to move towards a financial contract, we have yet to get there. And earlier this morning, Commissioner Taruk was actually discussing how there are studies together with the DOE that will allow us to move towards that. Because right now, the regulator is on a cost-based methodology in reviewing the power supply contracts, and it's basically really seen as a physical contract.
Thank you. Perhaps at this point it would be good to ask Raul, our academic observer, his thoughts as well on the EPIRA and how it has helped promote competition in the market. But before you do that, it might also be good to take one step back and sort of give your assessment as well on market power in the power market.
I was very skeptical of EPIRA. I tell you, I started out with tremendous skepticism. I thought we were embracing too many highfalutin things without understanding the local situation. Over time, however, and I think we have to accept the fact that bumpy is the norm here. Over time, it became clearer and clearer to me that the horizons look better than the present. And ARCOA is one of those things. You see, it is almost impossible politically to shift the franchises of ECs. But ARCOA says that the clients or the customers of electric cooperatives can choose. So if you implement ARCOA properly in EC jurisdictions, in electric cooperative jurisdictions, it means that you are freeing big industry and manufacturing and commercial consumers in these jurisdictions from the vagaries of electric cooperative power supply. What we're seeing is that electric cooperative power supply is more volatile, it's more unstable, has a tendency to brownouts. But if you now implement ARCOA, then at least the big players, the big locators in these areas can now hope for better power supply in the future. I have a feeling that the power supply situation in EC jurisdictions really has hamstrung the economic prospects of these jurisdictions. Although the possibility here is the ECs will now become wires. They are just wires business. So the regulation will now concentrate on the wires because they can always charge as high as the heavens, and you are still not going to have that facility. The second one is that this ARCOAization of consumers, of captive consumers, will apply only to rather huge consumers, unless of course we bring it down to retail, to household level. And it will only apply to those electric cooperatives that are connected with the grid. You're connected with the grid, it's so much easier to become a client of an RES, because RES are big and they want to send their electrons through the wires, right? So the ARCOA is an interesting feature which can unlock the jurisdictions of electric cooperatives which is governed by a franchise. And moving franchises is just impossible. the Congress will not touch it. But if we can implement ARCOA, then we are able to improve the economic prospects of these areas, which is quite interesting.
And I'd just like to add that actually when we move towards full implementation of retail competition and open access, the distribution utilities, the electric cooperatives and the private distribution utilities do not lose business. They are just able actually to concentrate on the distribution because that is precisely, that's why they're called distribution utilities. And well, I'd like to say in defense of electric cooperatives, it's not entirely their fault that there is a that the distribution leaves much to be desired. When the unbundling of the cost of electricity came to pass, they would now necessarily have to review the cost of distribution, supply, and metering. And also the capital expenditure requirements to be able to upgrade, first to maintain their distribution network and upgrade depending on the progressiveness also of the area or of the franchise. And it's quite difficult when you have electric cooperatives with geographic terrains that are different from one another. It's easy for us to say that maybe we are closest to Singapore in terms of the structure, governance, and whatnot. But Singapore is one whole big city. The Philippines, you have islands, you have trees that will suddenly grow from under the wires. There's a joke there because it's actually become some kind of a business. The transmission operator, the system operator will suddenly get a billing for the cost of having to cut down trees that were not there before under the transmission line, something like that. Even electric cooperatives also have that challenge. So, from an old system of a distribution infrastructure that used to have, just the most basic wooden poles, uninsulated wires, you now move towards insulated wires, steel poles and whatnot, having to move your poles from one area to another, or even just on the same street because there's a road widening going on, and all of that goes in to the cost of the electric utility. Those are also the challenges that they have to live with, not to mention the fact that when they entered into contracts, probably the old contracts that they've had, there was no ARCOA to speak of yet. Yes, ARCOA was in the horizon, but oh my God, what if it does not happen and I'm here made to sign a 20-year power supply contract? So if you carve out the demand of a contestable customer in a particular electric utility, it may happen that suddenly he loses 30%. Actually, I use 30% because that's the biggest that we've seen. He may suddenly lose 30% of his demand. Or the fact that if you carve that out from him, his system loss number, except that you just have to balance again the different interests of the stakeholders who will be affected by these policy changes.